At the bottom of Pearl Harbor, a battleship still rests where it sank. More than 80 years have passed since the morning it was destroyed, yet the ship has never been moved. Beneath the calm waters of the harbor, its shattered hull remains exactly where it fell during one of the most devastating attacks in American history. Above the wreck stands a white memorial visited by millions of people each year. But beneath that structure lies the ship itself. USS Arizona, BB-39. Even today, the battleship continues to release something from the past. Small droplets of oil slowly rise from the wreck. They drift upward through the water in thin, black beads, spreading across the surface of the harbor in faint rainbow patterns. The process is slow and almost silent. Some days, only a few droplets appear. Other days, the sheen is more visible, forming delicate streaks across the water. Visitors standing at the memorial often notice the shimmering film floating above the wreck. Many have given it a name. They call it the Tears of the Arizona. The oil leaking from the ship comes from fuel trapped inside the wreck when the battleship sank in 1941. Experts estimate that hundreds of thousands of gallons were sealed within the hull after the explosion that destroyed the vessel. More than 8 decades later, tiny amounts continue to escape. The slow release has become a haunting reminder of what lies beneath. Because the Arizona is not just a wreck, it is also a grave. Inside the twisted remains of the battleship are the bodies of more than 900 sailors and Marines who died when the ship exploded during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many of them were never recovered, and they remain where they fell, inside the ship where they had been serving that morning. For visitors standing above the wreck, the rising droplets of oil carry a powerful symbolism. It feels as if the ship itself is still remembering the men who died within it. The battleship that once represented American naval strength has become something else. A silent memorial beneath the water. A reminder of a morning when the United States was suddenly pulled into a global war. To understand how the Arizona came to rest at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, we must go back to the beginning, when the ship was first built as one of the most powerful battleships in the American fleet. When USS Arizona was commissioned in 1916, she represented the growing power of the United States Navy. The early 20th century was an era when battleships dominated naval strategy. Nations around the world competed to build larger ships with heavier guns and thicker armor. These vessels were designed to control the seas through sheer firepower. Arizona was part of that expansion. Built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the battleship belonged to the Pennsylvania class, a generation of warships designed to carry heavier weapons and improved protection compared to earlier American battleships. At more than 600 feet long, the ship was massive for its time. Her main armament consisted of 12 14-inch guns mounted in 4 enormous turrets. Each of these guns could fire shells weighing over 1,300 pounds capable of striking targets more than 20 miles away. When all 12 guns fired together, the blast could shake the entire ship. Armor plating protected the battleship's most critical areas. Thick steel surrounded the gun turrets, engines, and ammunition magazines, designed to shield the vessel from enemy shells during naval battles. Below deck, powerful steam turbines drove the ship through the water. At full speed, Arizona could reach about 21 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the American battle fleet. But a battleship was more than steel and weapons. It was also a floating community. At full complement, Arizona carried nearly 1,500 sailors and Marines. The crew lived and worked inside a maze of compartments, corridors, and machinery spaces deep within the ship's hull. Life aboard followed strict routines. Sailors stood watch in rotating shifts. Engineers monitored the boilers and turbines that powered the ship. Gunners trained constantly with the massive weapons mounted above deck. For decades, the battleship served as a visible symbol of American naval strength. She participated in fleet exercises across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, representing the growing influence of the United States on the world seas. By 1941, Arizona had been in service for 25 years. Although newer ships had begun to enter the fleet, the battleship remained an important part of the Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. For the sailors aboard, life continued according to familiar rhythms: morning drills, maintenance duties, evening watch rotations. Few of them knew that the ship would soon become the center of one of the most devastating attacks in naval history. The morning of December 7th, 1941, began quietly at Pearl Harbor. It was a Sunday. Across the harbor, sailors aboard the Pacific Fleet were easing into the slower routine of a weekend morning. Some ships prepared for inspections or light maintenance. Others allowed their crews a few extra hours of rest before the day's duties began. On board USS Arizona, the day started like many others. In the galley, cooks prepared breakfast for the crew. Mess attendants carried trays of food through narrow passageways below deck. Sailors gathered in dining spaces, drinking coffee and talking about the coming week. Some men planned to attend Sunday church services later that morning. Others were still asleep in their bunks. At that moment, the United States was not yet at war. But far across the Pacific, the Japanese Navy had already launched one of the most carefully planned surprise attacks in modern history. Shortly before 8 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached the Hawaiian Islands. The planes flew low over the ocean, avoiding radar detection as long as possible. Their target was the American fleet anchored inside Pearl Harbor. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions erupted across the harbor as Japanese aircraft began attacking battleships, airfields, and military installations. Within minutes, the quiet Sunday morning turned into chaos. Sailors rushed to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Smoke began rising from ships across the harbor. On board USS Arizona, crew members scrambled to respond as the attack unfolded around them. Alarms sounded through the ship. Men ran through passageways toward their assigned stations. Gunners raced to anti-aircraft weapons mounted on the deck. Officers attempted to assess what was happening while aircraft roared overhead. The battleship had been caught by surprise. Japanese dive bombers soon began targeting the ships anchored along Battleship Row, where several American battleships, including Arizona, were moored side by side. One of those aircraft lined up for an attack on the Arizona. The bomber released a single armor-piercing bomb. The weapon fell toward the battleship. It struck near the forward turret, penetrating through the ship's deck, before exploding deep inside the hull. Seconds later, the bomb reached one of the most dangerous areas aboard the ship: the ammunition magazine. Inside that compartment were massive quantities of gunpowder and explosive shells used to supply the battleship's main guns. When the bomb ignited the magazine, the result was catastrophic. A massive explosion tore through the forward half of the ship. Witnesses across Pearl Harbor saw a towering fireball rise hundreds of feet into the sky. The blast was so powerful that it lifted parts of the ship's structure into the air before they crashed back into the harbor. The front section of the battleship was destroyed almost instantly. Men working in the forward compartments had no chance of survival. Flames swept across the deck as burning fuel and ammunition erupted from the shattered hull. Thick black smoke billowed upward, visible from every ship in the harbor. The explosion was one of the most violent moments of the entire attack on Pearl Harbor. And within seconds, USS Arizona had been mortally wounded. The explosion that destroyed the forward half of USS Arizona happened in seconds. For many sailors aboard the battleship, there was no warning and no opportunity to escape. The detonation of the ammunition magazine had unleashed a force powerful enough to tear apart steel decks, gun turrets, and internal compartments almost instantly. The front of the ship became an inferno. Flames shot through passageways and ventilation shafts. Burning oil spread across the harbor surface around the vessel. Pieces of twisted metal and debris rained down onto nearby ships and into the water. Across Battleship Row, sailors on other vessels watched in shock as the fireball erupted from the Arizona. Some rushed to assist survivors who had been thrown into the harbor by the blast. But the damage to the battleship was overwhelming. The explosion had destroyed critical internal structures and opened massive holes in the hull. Water poured into the shattered sections of the ship, in flooding compartments that had once housed engines, equipment, and living quarters. Within minutes, the battleship began to settle deeper into the harbor. The sinking itself was not dramatic. There was no slow roll onto the side like a capsizing ship. Instead, Arizona simply collapsed downward, the destroyed bow dragging the rest of the hull beneath the surface until the ship rested on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The entire process took less than 9 minutes. When the fires finally began to subside, The scale of the tragedy became clear. A total of 1,177 sailors and Marines had been killed aboard USS Arizona. Many died instantly in the explosion. Others were trapped below deck, unable to escape as smoke, fire, and flooding spread through the ship. It was the single greatest loss of life during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Recovery crews worked for days searching the wreck for survivors and recovering bodies. But most of the fallen crew members could not be reached. The remains of hundreds of sailors were left inside the ship, and there they remain today. In the years following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the wreck of USS Arizona remained where it had sunk. Unlike some damaged ships that were repaired and returned to service, Arizona was considered beyond recovery. The explosion that destroyed the battleship had shattered much of the hull and internal structure, leaving the vessel resting permanently on the floor of the harbor. But the wreck quickly became something more than a sunken warship. It became a grave. Inside the remains of the battleship were the bodies of hundreds of sailors and Marines who had died during the attack. Many could not be recovered without dismantling large sections of the ship, and the Navy ultimately chose to leave the wreck undisturbed. Over time, the site came to be treated as a place of remembrance. In 1962, the United States completed construction of the USS Arizona Memorial, a white concrete structure built directly above the sunken battleship. The memorial spans the wreck without touching it, allowing visitors to stand above the resting place of the ship and the men who died aboard her. Each year, millions of people travel to Pearl Harbor to visit the site. Inside the memorial, a quiet room displays the names of the 1,177 crew members who were killed during the attack. The names are engraved on a marble wall, forming a lasting tribute to the sailors and Marines lost that morning. For some survivors of the ship, the connection to Arizona never ended. In the decades after the war, several former crew members chose to have their ashes placed inside the wreck after their deaths. Divers gently carry the urns down to the battleship and place them within the hull, allowing the sailors to return to the ship where they once served. In this way, the Arizona remains both a historical site and a military grave. A battleship that once sailed across the Pacific has become a permanent resting place beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor. When USS Arizona sank in December 1941, the battleship carried enormous quantities of fuel oil inside its tanks. Much of that oil burned during the explosion and the fires that followed the attack. But not all of it. When the wreck settled on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, an estimated 500,000 gallons of fuel oil remained trapped inside the ship's damaged hull. Sealed within compartments and tanks deep inside the wreck, the oil was left untouched when the battleship became a memorial. Over time, small amounts began to escape. Even today, more than 8 decades later, tiny droplets of oil still seep slowly from the wreck. The process is gradual and unpredictable. Some days only a few drops appear. Other days a faint rainbow-colored sheen spreads across the surface of the harbor. Visitors standing inside the memorial often see the thin black beads rising from the water below. They drift upward quietly, breaking the surface in delicate circles. Many people who witness the phenomenon have given it a name. They call it the Tears of the Arizona. For many visitors, the sight is deeply emotional. The oil rising from the wreck feels like a reminder that the ship and the men who died aboard her are still present beneath the harbor waters. More than 8 decades have passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The wreck of USS Arizona has never been raised. It remains exactly where it fell on the morning of December 7, 1941, resting quietly on the floor of the harbor beneath the white memorial that spans the water above it. Around the world, many ships lost in war have been salvaged or dismantled. Arizona was not. The United States Navy chose to leave the battleship in place as a permanent tribute to the sailors and Marines who died aboard her. Today, the wreck is both a historic landmark and a military grave. Millions of visitors travel to Pearl Harbor each year to stand above the ship and reflect on the events that unfolded there. Beneath the surface, the shattered hull remains unchanged. A silent monument beneath the water, a reminder of the cost of war, and a final resting place for the 1,177 sailors and Marines who never left their ship.